Good afternoon. Welcome to our second CUES research webinar series, where we will hear from 4 people who conducted their dissertation research at East High School. Dissertations are the culminating projects of doctoral study and represent a tremendous amount of work. Each of the researchers on this panel used qualitative research design to conduct their studies. What this means is that they focus on how people make meaning in their everyday lives. They observe what people do, take notes, conduct interviews and focus groups, and review documents. It's the researcher's responsibility to interpret these data, to answer their research question, to ground it in what we already know about the issue, and to develop implications for research, policy, and practice. It is my distinct pleasure to introduce Ms. Cassandra Kelly, who will serve as our moderator. Ms. Kelly is the benefits coordinator at Action for a Better Community in Rochester. She is an active grandparent of 2 graduating seniors at East. She has been a dedicated member of the Family and Community Engagement team at East and currently serves as co-chair of that committee. She's also a member of the East Research Committee that is responsible for approving research at East. Ms. Kelly, please take it away.
Thank you. Good afternoon and welcome to all. First, we would like to introduce our panel today. The first person I'd like to introduce is Alexa Basil. The next individual that's dissertating today will be Eleni Durrett. The next person will be Shalanda Garfield. And the next person after that will be Ankela Paco. And that will be our panel that will present today.
Thank you for joining us this afternoon. My name is Alexa Basile-Hogeston, and I have been a literacy specialist at East Lower School for the past 7 years and completed my doctorate this time last May after completing my dissertation titled Youth-Led Participatory Action Research, or YPAR, Exploring New Literacies and Critical Literacy Pedagogy in a Virtual Teaching and Learning Environment. Next slide. This afternoon, I will work through the main parts of my action research study and my process. I began thinking about my role at East as an educator, and throughout my EDD program, I realized that my true passion was facilitating authentic reading and writing practices with my middle schoolers. I worked to combine authentic educational experiences with my literacy background and crafted these 2 questions with the goal of facilitating YPAR, or Youth Participatory Action Research, with my 7th grade students to provide them with opportunities to conduct research on their own on topics and issues that they find important and impact their lives, while also discovering the literacy practices through this process. My first question: what are the literacy practices or new literacies, which I'll talk about, of participants, including students, teachers, community members in YPAR? And then my second question: what happens when I attempt to build a critical literacy teaching practice around YPAR? Slide 6. The research approach taken by students combined YPAR, or Youth Participatory Action Research. This was done by my students, so they were the researchers. Critical literacy and new literacy studies, which I'll talk more about, but those were the lenses that I worked to combine that I looked through my research with. In other words, Youth Participatory Action Research, or YPAR, was the inquiry process that students took to discuss research and challenge community issues connected to their own lived experiences. And as a researcher, I used critical literacy as a lens to unveil the literacy practices that they were finding present in their own research process. This image shows the research steps taken by students throughout their process with building connections, brainstorming, research, and then challenging social justice topics that are meaningful and relevant to them. Social justice topics illustrated were mental health awareness, racial injustices in education, gender biases, environmental justice, COVID-19 and vulnerable communities, equitable housing, crime, and transportation and equitable housing. Slide 7. To tell the story about my findings from my first research question dealing with the literacy practices, specifically new literacies or the use of using digital tools, I unveiled themes dealing with how participants were selecting, communicating, processing, and sharing information with each other in their research process to discuss and challenge their chosen community issues. And I did all of my action research during a virtual teaching and learning experience last fall. So my students were completely virtual. They used the application called Jamboard to show how students shared and gave feedback to their peers as students planned their research claim. Students used to discuss criteria based off of the rubric, gave peers feedback to discuss ways to help and strengthen their writing. And then the second example shows how students discussed student-gathered discussion prompts of whether or not our community had resources that benefited everyone through the use of the Padlet application. The example you see here is an example of the writing process where students offered feedback through the use of Google Docs. For my second question about building critical literacy teaching, it is important to note that these digital tools that you saw in the past few slides supported the new literacy studies throughout the framework, but also saw relationships across how digital platforms also supported the critical literacy framework, because the use of digital tools helped elevate student voice and how they challenged and spread awareness about these social injustices, especially during a pandemic when challenging these issues cannot be done easily in person. 2 points that can be made from my findings related to my second research question focused on critical literacy and how it supports student voice, shown through empowerment and analyzing power, and critical literacy and how it supports student voice shown through social emotional learning. A critical element of critical literacy is how students' prior knowledge, previous experiences, and language abilities can be used to build a curriculum so that it is meaningful to them. They built this curriculum. It wasn't me. I was the facilitator. They did all the work. Slide 10. This example of student work shows how my theoretical frameworks of new literacy studies and the use of digital tools and critical literacy and elevating student voice allowed a student that was not expected to be able to participate effectively in my literacy class. He was supposed to be in how our literacy program is structured in a more foundational literacy class, but it was shown that engaging with digital sources, different texts that interested him, researching across online spaces about community issues that he really cared about, it was shown that he attended his literacy class far more frequently during a virtual teaching and learning environment compared to his other classes, and was successful in our entire YPAR process. Slide 11. Given the social nature of learning and literacy, this research has expanded the interaction of social, historical, and cultural contexts through a virtual teaching and learning environment. My students circulated information on their own challenges, connecting them to societal challenges, and reminded us that participatory expression is linked with their identities and the societal power structure. This work has been done by university researchers in the past, working alongside teachers, but may not be done by teachers, especially teachers of Black and Brown students in urban contexts. I was able to realize the very real connections that students were making to their own lives and hopefully let them know that there is a space in any context, school and community, to analyze power, become motivated by their lived experiences, collaborate with peers in online settings, and work for transformative change in their own lives and in others. For our next presenter, please welcome Eleni Durrett.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for this opportunity to share my dissertation research with you all, titled Conversations Around the Kiln, Understanding and Communicating Concepts of Identity in the Visual Arts Classroom. Next slide. My research revolves around one primary research question, which is, what is the nature of dialogic construction of identity in a visual arts class? The purpose of my phenomenological study, which I'll explain in a little bit, is to explore the conversational and collaborative construction of identity through the visual arts, which takes place between teachers and students and among students and teachers as well. The dialogic construction of identity can be understood as a process in which identity is informed, developed, and tempered by social, cultural, and historical contexts that individuals engage with, contribute to, and maintain. This construction encompasses the relational, developmental, and explorational and expressive possibilities of identity. And this image you see here is a chart that one of the teachers who participated in my study has up in his room. So in this space, even though all of the teachers who participated identify as white, they were very thoughtful and tried to be very intentional about the way they discuss race in the classroom. Something that I had the privilege of experiencing when I was growing up with a very thoughtful teacher. So my research is not only personal, but about the experiences that I've witnessed while being at East High School. Next slide. So here is a coil pot that was created by a student during my time in this research. The base, as explained by Dr. Larson, is the foundation of my research, which is qualitative and honors the multiple ways of knowing and constructing knowledge in our communities. The center structure of the research is organized around phenomenological research, which focuses on the lived experiences of participants and the process of creating unique description of those experiences. And the last, what I call the cherry on top, is the arts-informed inquiry requires the artistic experiences and practices as central research to inform the final phenomenon. So next slide. I facilitated 3 different art activities with the participants that you see here, including the participants included 3 art teachers and 9 students. So these 3 activities, one started with asking teachers and students to provide visual expressions of what their identity is or how they see it. The center was an opportunity for students to explain their relationships to teachers and students at school, thinking of themselves as the center of a solar system and these different individuals revolving around them. And then the last part of my research was a collaborative collage that the participating students and teachers created together as a way to explain and show how they understood each other's identities. Next slide. So of this, and based off of these different arts experiences and data sources, 3 different structures appeared for this phenomenon. The first is that time together between students and teachers is a dialogic process that develops comfort and identity expression. So this image you see here is one of the collages the students created for one of their teachers. And they were very adamant on focusing on these grapes because they said that it represented the first time that they had lunch with this teacher and the teacher shared her grapes with him. So he said that coming up to have lunch with her is something he looks forward to every day, not only to spend time with her, but to be able to create art. Another thing is that of the students who participated, 3 of them are EHS alumni, and 1 student actually decided to take time off of work and use his vacation time in order to come participate in the study and to have lunch with his teacher, showing that they both felt this sense of comfort in spending extra time with their teachers, and it was a way for them to be able to share who they are and learn more about their teachers. Next slide. The second structure of the phenomenon is that there are multiple sides to our identities, some that we can see and some that we cannot see. And we as individuals have some autonomy in how we share our multiple selves. So what you see here is a coil pot created in the ceramics courses at East, where students are asked to incorporate different components of their identity into the pot. And the students in my study expressed having to think a lot about what they want to show in the classroom and being mindful of that there might be some parts of themselves they don't want to share. One student even used this image here as a way to explain identity as having multiple sides. And she specifically said that you never know, somebody's outside can be calm, smiling, or even happy, but inside it could be like they're fighting many battles. And then the third phenomenon for the next slide is that creativity can generate self-assurance and provide a pathway for processing trauma. So one student submitted this photo as a way to express her identity, which is a recording artist that she listened to regularly during the pandemic. And she explained that listening to this music and actually doing creative work and creating art helped her release some of the pain she was experiencing and some of the pain from isolation, particularly during the pandemic. And so this is an opportunity for them to not only process trauma, but also develop self-confidence. I apologize, my dog is excited to be here as well. Next slide. So what I found in understanding my dialogic positioning and aesthetic education theories in this space is that teachers play a significant role in how students understand themselves and express their identity, what is called a promoter position. So through the establishment of a classroom environment in which students feel accepted and safe to share their personal experiences, students can then really understand who they are and how they want to present themselves. I also found that through the arts, students can motivate themselves to create an image of who they are in the world around them based off of what they want to see. Meta positioning is when students and teachers work together to question the world around them, to develop a critical voice as a way to then, again, create and understand what it means to have a more just social experience, which they can do through the arts. And the last, which is called third positioning, is another critical opportunity for students and teachers to question the relationship between experience and culture, and to examine how experiences shape individual identity. And this is a self-portrait one of the students who participated in my research created, and said that doing so with her art teacher as a support made it so it was easier to fully embody herself in this portrait. Last slide. So in conclusion, the dialogic process of identity requires intense faith in humankind and in faith in our power to make and recreate a world that we want to see. So therefore, I use my own dialogic response to this research to create a collage that visually expresses the unique nature of the dialogic construction of identity in a visual arts setting that cannot be expressed solely through words. So the phenomenological research in this case, with the infusion of the arts through critical aesthetic pedagogy, requires that research and researchers see the participants as theorists in their own everyday lives and practices. I am happy to introduce our next speaker, who is Ankala Paco.
Thank you, Lady. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Ankala Paco. I apologize. I have a cold, so I hope you can all hear me. I am the Director of Mathematics in the Rochester City School District. Thank you for inviting me in this space. I will start introducing my study, which is its title, the first slide, which is titled Coach Learning from Analyzing Her Own Practice and Responding to Teachers. And this was an action research. So my study was conducted at East High School last year during the COVID-19 and included 2 teachers, which served as the participants in the study. It's totally focused on coaching and teacher and coach relationship. Next slide. So as I set up the ground for the research and for the study itself, literature on coaching offers very little in terms of the coaching practices and how those coaching practices are conducted. Therefore, the purpose of this study was to investigate coaching discursive tendencies and the teacher perceptions of coaching over multiple coaching cycles. Next slide. So some of the research questions that I attempted to understand and investigate were, the first one is, what do teachers self-report about their learning, change in practice, and relationships with the coach as they engage in content-focused coaching? The second one was, what are some of the coaching moves and forms of assistance related to teachers' perceptions of coaching experiences? And the third research question that I investigated and this study attempts to understand is, what were the coaching moves, stanzas, and forms of assistance that were evident in a content-focused coaching cycle? Next slide. As an action research, this study included 2 teachers in the upper school, 2 mathematics teachers, and those teachers went through 3 different individual coaching cycles with me. So the data sources that were collected were mainly focused on the on the coaching cycle itself, but also on pre-coaching interview and post-coaching interview. Next slide. As I mentioned before, this study took place during the pandemic, the COVID-19. It was conducted last year, where most of our schools remain not open to students, and all the instruction was conducted via Zoom remotely. So something particular and unique about this study, because coaching was conducted remotely, so was teaching. Instruction was actually enacted remotely. So these are two examples of the coaching with the teacher, and this is another way, or one of the ways that are interacted with them during the study. Next slide. In this particular slide, I want to bring forward some of the themes that emerged through analysis of the interviews that both teachers participated in. And then, as you can see, different themes emerged. Teachers felt that coaching influenced their content in the practice, but also coaching influenced student learning. It was quite interesting because this study also pointed out a few other themes in terms of the coaching practices, as teachers spoke about how coaching itself, planning and the debriefing and the coaching structure actually helped them with the coaching goals or the goals that they had as learners. Next slide. As this study attempted to understand also, or to investigate the coaching practice per se, or what the coaches do and say to support teacher learning, there were 5 different moves that this study brought forward, or they identified 5 different groups. So there were groups in terms of the coaching moves that the coach, I as a coach actually enacted, were divided into action and reaction types of coaching moves, and then also neutral to some sort of actions. So elicitation and suggestions were those 2 moves that actually kind of provoke a response or required an action in terms of the teachers with planning their lessons or debriefing and commenting on their lessons, versus explanations, evaluations, and descriptions were coaching moves that did not necessarily result in any actions in terms of the teachers. Next slide. This diagram shows a representation of the study in the simplest form, as I'm trying to indicate, or as I'm trying to kind of read through the findings of the study. So the teacher and coach interactions, therefore coaching, depended, the first one that I have identified, depending on the context and special circumstances, those played key role in how much and to what extent teachers engaged into the core elements of content-focused coaching, which is the common model that they used at East. Next slide. The second key element that appeared from this study in terms of how coaching was conducted, or how coaching influenced teacher learning, was that teachers' previous coaching experiences, their own preferences of how to receive coaching, served as a filter, or they were very important to consider in the process of how coaching influenced their learning. Next slide. The last one, but not the least one, is that while research suggests that coaching in itself, it's not responsive to teachers' learning and teacher needs, this is most of the research coming forward to us. This particular study showed that coaching was adapted to teacher needs and to the circumstances, as I pointed out on the previous finding. And therefore, even the coach's preferences in itself also were molded to kind of understand a little bit better teacher needs, and then they were adjusted or balanced to support those needs. And the last finding, and then the key and the most important one that surfaced even during the actual coaching and during the teachers' interviews, was that coach-teacher relationship was key and important to teachers accepting coaching as one vehicle for them to learn and grow. Therefore, strong and trusting relationships between the coach and the teacher were necessary to support coaching and to support their learning. As I move on to the next slide, some of the implications of this study for leaders and for coaches and educators in the field is that for coaches, it's important to have an awareness of the types of discursive moves that they use as part of their practice, and then how those particular moves function to support and impact teacher learning. And then if coaches have that awareness, they will be able to balance through. So then they really truly understand teacher needs and support them with the goals that they set for themselves. Also, in some parts of the presentation of the findings, I spoke about the conditions or the contents of the context of the study. The supporting conditions at East made this a positive experience for the teachers. However, education leaders need to closely examine the school culture, closely examine the time and the resources that they had at hand in order to invest in a coaching model that will be effective and it will be supportive of teachers' needs. And I came to the conclusion of my presentation, and I will introduce my dear friend, Shalonda Garfield. She will move on to her presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Ankela. Good afternoon. I am Shalonda Garfield, an elementary school principal in the Rochester City School District. My research dissertation focused on increasing parent engagement in a high poverty urban school, specifically East Lower School. Next slide, please. So the purpose of my study was to really look at parent engagement at East, specifically East Lower School. There's ongoing conversations in schools across the nation regarding the need to improve parent engagement, especially in urban schools or in populations that serve under marginalized populations. Parents are the most underutilized resource in education today. At East specifically, 90% of their student population is considered economically disadvantaged. So for the purposes of this study, I focus on parent engagement among Black and Latino families. So research suggests that sociopolitical ideologies, racial barriers, and cultural biases reflect the underutilization of parent involvement in schools. Many of these ideologies stem from a historical basis that continues to influence school officials' attitudes about parents, as well as parents' attitudes about schools. Inadequate parent engagement is often seen as a problem for Black and Latino families and not necessarily for others. There's always a great deal of blaming about why parents are not involved, and there's also excuses about why educators fail to involve them. So my research focused on increasing parent engagement in order to improve educational outcomes for all students. Parents need to be engaged in authentic ways where they see themselves as partners in their children's education, share responsibility and accountability for student success. Next slide, please. So the data sources that were used, I conducted interviews and focus groups. So interviews with parents, school administrators at East Lower School, and focus groups with parents and teachers from East Lower School. Next slide. So the research questions that were addressed in my study, I specifically looked at what factors motivate parents to become involved in their child's education. And so efficacy was definitely a factor that motivates families, specifically parents' capacity to assist their children with schoolwork. Advocacy. So marginalized parents are constantly fighting for their constitutional rights to equal opportunity in education, while research shows that dominant middle-class elite status parents are fighting to retain their domination of educational resources, representing the injustice that marginalized populations are confronted with. in schools in particular, across the nation, perpetuate this cycle of privileging these middle-class ideologies through the inequitable practices. And so school officials continue to foster this deficit view when parents are confronted with discriminatory assumptions and inequitable educational opportunities for their children. And this leads to parents getting involved in their child's education to act as an advocate for their child, but it also creates a barrier because Black and Latino parents are less likely to engage with schools due to the mistrust and the inequities that are imposed on their children. Activism was also found to be a key motivation for parents to become involved in their child's education, and that activism results from the disparate treatment, the lack of academic interventions, some teachers' lack of interest, enthusiasm, or concern for engaging parents in their child's education, and racism that is built in school systems. And it's this constant wave of parents, Black and Latino parents in particular, having to experience this wave of racism throughout their child's schooling experience. So some parents are motivated to become involved as activists in their child's education. Invitation was also a factor that contributes to parent involvement. So that invitation coming from the school or from their child. So the second research question specifically was, what are the barriers that lead to disengagement for parents? So some barriers that were found are communication barriers, racism, lack of resources, parent availability, and lack of interpersonal relationships with between the school and families. Next slide. So increasing parent engagement in schools. So there were 6 objectives that were found to be effective in increasing parent engagement in schools. The first one is nurturing an environment that parents and caregivers feel is welcoming, fostering trusting relationships between families and teachers and all school staff, increasing parent understanding of their role as educational partners, reducing barriers to parent involvement in school activities and events, and fostering reciprocal two-way parent-teacher communication, and fostering true family partnerships where families are empowered to engage in school-wide decision-making. Next slide. So in looking at those 6 objectives, I evaluated those six objectives using a decision analysis framework. And during the interviews and focus groups, I specifically spoke to teachers, parents, and administrators about those key objectives and what they believed what they believed is in place currently at East and what would enhance current practices. So the first objective, nurturing an environment that parents, caregivers feel is welcoming. Some key findings there was consensus across stakeholders at East that there are many parent engagement efforts in place, but there's a need for improved communication of those efforts, the resources available, and opportunities available to families. So stakeholders expressed a strong desire to enhance their current practices. There's a quote from one parent that said, parents don't know what they don't know. So if the doors are open for school and there's resources and opportunities available to the parents that they don't have knowledge of, what good is that, right? So if they're there, how are we making sure that the school is communicating that those resources and opportunities are available? So one teacher specifically said that parents needed a space, right, to gather for multiple purposes, whether that's, a workshop, phone access, technology to check their child's grades and assignments, a room to be able to have tea time or be able to connect with other parents. And it was really important that, an administrator shared that the school does embrace involvement, parent involvement, and recognize that parents are important assets to the school. So there was consensus that there's efforts to increase parent engagement. However, improved communication about the efforts, resources, opportunities needed to be increased. Next slide, please. So the second objective, foster trusting relationships between families and teachers and school staff. So some key findings, there's this stigma, right, between school officials and also Black and Latino families. And it's important that, one teacher said, we have to work to repair the relationship, even if we are not the teachers that parents had the bad situations with, but we have to break that stigma, right? So when we think about the intersections of race and class and how it manifests itself in educational environments, that creates barriers and obstacles to parent engagement. So, there is consensus that needs to be addressed, and that the strengthening of those relationships between families and teachers is really important. There's also a need for more intentional focus on parent engagement through an action plan, and parent voice needs to be at the table. So there is a common theme of this idea of learning and working together. So parents and school staff, and creating opportunities where parents and staff can connect through sharing their different perspectives and insights. Next slide. The third objective, increasing parent understanding of their role as educational partners. So one key finding was this theme of lacking understanding of the role of parents as educational partners from both the parents and the school staff. And that there's a missing link, which goes back to communication. So one parent specifically said, parent roles need to be defined collaboratively, because a partnership may look different depending on the parent, their availability, their beliefs about school, and parents can support their child from home, whether that's checking homework, grades, or giving them a good meal. And parents, this particular parent felt that they think that's how they're fulfilling their role, right? And a teacher specifically said, I don't really know the role a parent has, nor do I think that we make it clear what we expect from parents. And similarly, another teacher stated, I think we naturally just expect parents to be supportive if we reach out, but that's not truly partnering with them. And an administrator mentioned, it's difficult to measure parent understanding of their role in the educational partnership, because those roles have not been defined. So it's really critically important that the role of parents as educational partners is defined collaboratively, as the parents requested with parents. Next slide. Reducing barriers to parent involvement in school activities and events. So key finding was there's a need for greater transparency, again, about the resources, activities, events, and supports available at the school, and improved communication would lead to greater transparency for families. So one parent stated, that East puts it out all on the table, right? They give you the information you need. They put information on the website. Teachers are nice. They reach out, they contact parents, but it's up to this particular parent stated it's up to the parents to get that information, right? And stating that the school can't force it in their heads. Another parent shared a perspective, well, I'm busy and I'm always working and I may not have time to check the website. So again, trying to reduce those barriers and dealing with parents on an individual basis and making sure that that communication plan works for that specific family. One teacher mentioned, that a culturally relevant approach to addressing parent engagement would allow the focus on various topics, and that has the potential to increase parent engagement and get parents more involved in the school. So specifically parent topics being on the agenda and parents leading the agenda, right? And this particular teacher thought that would be amazing. And we'd know for sure what's important to those parents. And that would help us to understand as educators, the barriers that are in place for those particular families. But that idea of parent voice was also a common theme. And administrators felt that, transparency helps to reduce barriers. So it's important to be very clear as the plan for parent engagement is being developed and the plan for these activities and events that are happening, that it's communicated and the intent of them is communicated to families. Foster reciprocal two-way parent-teacher communication. So some key findings there is that there's differing views on two-way communication and what that means for families and educators. So creating an individualized communication based on family need and culturally appropriate communication is important. And that came up constantly in this research. And a need for staff to feel comfortable contacting families and families communicating with staff. And that goes back to that relationship piece that was a common theme throughout the research. One parent mentioned, there's a parent portal, right? Info is shared, teachers call, they send letters, there's apps, there's social media, there's a lot of efforts on behalf of the school, but felt like, East shares the information with parents, but that communication is going one way, right? So how do we increase the information where parents are involved in their communicating and providing information to the school as well? A teacher suggested that, and this is a common theme, that an action plan would allow to make sure that we are planning multiple ways to communicate with families and that they have to be familiar with all the ways that communication is happening. And that communication needs to be individual based, depending on the family's needs. And administration stated that there's avenues to promote two-way communication and felt that they needed to look at and refine those processes that are in place, and that would have the potential to improve that reciprocal two-way parent-teacher communication. Next slide. Foster true family partnerships where families are empowered to engage in school-wide decision-making. So some key findings there. There are structures in place at East, but they need to be refined. There's consensus from stakeholders that the momentum is stagnant and that increasing opportunities for parents to feel empowered in decision-making would make parents feel more connected and engaged in the school community. So a parent mentioned, it's the same parents that are on governance council, the family and community engagement team that are involved in decisions, but the parents felt like that there could be more, right? And the teacher mentioned, it's important that parents see themselves as an equal in their child's education through decision-making, as opposed to, well, I don't know anything about education. I'm not sure I want to engage in that, right? So an approach where they feel like they're equal partners and have an equal voice lets parents know that they're valued and that we want to learn from them as well. It's not us doing school to them, but they have a voice in school and in decision-making and in their child's education. And administration stated that, opportunities exist, but it would only lead the current opportunities that are happening in terms of increasing parent engagement would only lead to 1 to 3 new parents each year is what's been averaged at the school during this time of the study in terms of increasing parent involvement on governance council or the family and community engagement committee. But the administration strongly believe that they can do better than that. And we're looking for, and we're open to ideas about how to increase so that there's more parents engaging in their governance councils and family and community engagement teams. Next slide, please. So research findings. Sorry about that, light went off. So in my research findings, I looked at the status quo was currently happening at East. We evaluated the PTA and looked at the PTO, which is typically used in schools, and parents and stakeholders believe that like PTA is kind of outdated and it gives a governmental bureaucratic vibe, and that was not going to work for East. We looked at the Children's Aid Society and their framework that is typically used to focus on parent engagement in schools. And again, that goes back to just creating an action plan, but there was a strong consensus that there was a need to do something new and different. So what came out of this research is, again, a key finding was looking at the intersections of race and class and how that manifests itself in the educational study, in the educational settings, and leads to obstacles for parent engagement, but a process such as Parent Corps that provides a culturally informed approach to engaging with families, focuses on strengthening relationships and communication, and discussing and being conscious of race relations. Parent Corps also incorporates professional development for staff that addresses racism and inequities in schools. It focuses on relationships between teacher and parent, and it includes a culturally relevant parenting intervention opportunity to educate parents, also learn alongside them in order to reduce the racial, ethnic, and socioeconomic disparities that occur in learning, behavior, and health. And so there was consensus across stakeholders that a more culturally informed approach would lead to that. So implications for future research. So there's a need to increase ethical and humane research that addresses the misalignment between marginalized families and educational researches. So evidence needs to be addressed through a critical analysis of the ways in which deficit discourse among Black and Latino families empowers and validates those dismissive practices that have long been perpetuated in schools. There needs to be policy that informs local decisions around practices related to parent engagement. Racism, classism, and discrimination in public school practices and policies is an area where research is needed to learn more about the impact on parent, teacher, and student relationships, and more importantly, how to eradicate it. And background variables such as education level, socioeconomic status, and ethnic cultural background must be taken in account when considering how schools go about forming these educational partnerships with families. And that concludes the findings of my research on increasing parent engagement at East. Any questions?
So Ms. Kelly, you ready to take
Yes.
some questions?
Yes. So one thing that was actually put into the chat, into the Q&A as we were going, and this question may be for you, Shalonda, as you're presenting on your panelists there, what more focus should be put on engaging fathers. Can you speak to that?
So absolutely, it's important that we are engaging parents, whether it's the mother, the father, grandparents, whoever the students identify as being their caretaker, whoever's that person, right? So it's really important that we are engaging all family members to support our students, but it definitely is more important to focus more on in recognizing, right, that there are fathers, right, in these households, and typically we reach out to mothers, right, but there are fathers, and we need to get them better engaged in their child's education as well.
Thank you. To the panel, that you have really driven your purpose in regard to your research, your findings, you've actually shared your results, your barriers, and a lot of your whys. For each person on the panel, can you tell me what's next? As you've done this research, what's next for you? We'll start with we'll start with you, Shalonda.
Sure, absolutely. So currently, being, a principal, parent engagement is really important at my school. So, just making sure that we are constantly focused on having a plan and how we engage with parents in looking at those key 6 objectives that we talked about, but making sure that we're also being culturally responsive in making sure it's relevant to families. So having an action plan, making parent engagement a priority, because as educators, we cannot increase the outcomes at an accelerated rate that we need to for Black and Latino students without parents' voice at the table. So really empowering them and making sure that they feel welcome in the school environment, school community, and making sure that they also feel and have a voice in decision-making. So that's really a top priority for me as a principal. And it's something that I'm leading my staff through with in terms of professional development to make sure that we're keeping that at the focus of how we are making continuous improvement in the school.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Alexa, can you address that question for me as well? What's next for you in your project?
Sure. I think even though the pandemic was really challenging for many educators and administrators, I think that it gave us a great time to begin to think about curriculum differently. So even though my research was done 100% virtually with my 7th graders, I think that even with the situation of the pandemic, I think our school building and other schools around the United States and the world have started to think about curriculum differently. So the way they're utilizing digital tools, how they're thinking about engaging students with authentic experiences related to their lives, especially with the systemic and societal challenges and issues that we face every day, and that's going on in our own community. I think that the way we start to rethink and restructure curriculum could aid students who may not find traditional success in school and in school building settings, and give them an opportunity to actually access rigorous reading and writing practices through a curriculum that is meaningful to them. So I'm hoping through my research, I've sort of kind of planted the seed as a teacher in a school building to begin to have these discussions with other educators.
Thank you. Same question for Ms. Paco.
Sure, thank you. I guess my study was a little bit different because it just addresses the fact that our teachers are learners, right? And they still need educators for educators. And that's where this study come in play. In terms of my role as the director of mathematics, I see direct impact, and hopefully this study is going to continue that journey to build those structures and systems to continue to educate or to continue to provide support to our teachers so they can increase their content knowledge, their pedagogical knowledge, and be responsive to student needs. So it's more about building those connections and pathways for our teachers to continue to learn and grow in that direction. And I guess this study started the process for me. And hopefully I can bring some of this work in the district so then we can start building the systems that will support our teachers to grow and learn and be successful, and actually design equitable mathematics instruction for all of our students in all of our schools, not just at East. So I'm very excited to kind of bring this forward.
Thank you.
And for me, I am excited I have some meetings with the teachers who participated in my research actually in these upcoming weeks, where we're going to look at some of the outcomes from this research and see how they can address some of the things that students brought forth in their classroom, in the curriculum, but also as a way to share the great information around how students feel in their classes with more content areas across East, especially how their work has influenced the development of culturally relevant and responsive pedagogy, and how they might be able to share what they've learned and how they do that in the arts in other content areas, so it can show up in more places. I think so often the arts get pushed to the side quite easily and quickly, and a lot of different reasons for that. And so I hope that this research can help show that it's really important for students to have this opportunity to engage in the arts as a way to understand their identities, not just for their own well-being while in high school, but for their future. And so my goal is to continue to work with these teachers as I've continued to be at East in the art spaces, discussing how we can further this and share it with more people at East as well as other schools.
Thank you. So this is a follow-up question for you, Alani. This question comes back to you. So the question in the Q&A is now, of course, thank you for your wonderful research emphasizing the arts and youth education and your connection during this educational career that you're in. So in your research, did you find any lack of support or resources in the arts during your research? And if so, how can we support as a society?
That's a great question. I think in terms of resources, there was one particular time that I can speak of in terms of concrete resources in the arts is that the students had a really hard time accessing various colors of brown. And that may not seem like too big of a deal because we can mix and make new colors, but the teachers expressed being out of the funding to buy more paints and how that makes it so students have to really change the way that they show their pigmentation in their own artwork. And so that has lasting effects on how we see ourselves and how we understand ourselves if you don't have the tool to create yourself in the artwork. But on the other hand, the teachers were very creative in how they got around some of these resource issues. As you saw in that one of the first images, how teachers show to blend colors in order to get different skin tones. The The teachers have been very creative in reusing their own resources, their own money, their own past student information, past student resources to continue to do this work in the classroom. So that to me is the only resource that I can think of off the top of my head that's like concrete. But then the other resources that teachers don't often get an opportunity to have culturally relevant, responsive pedagogical training just related to the arts. So they engage in it from a peripheral perspective based off of what the entire school is doing. And there's a missed opportunity for them to get that professional development. So I see it as there's potential space for more resources on the development side of the teachers, but then also the actual supplies that the students are using in the classroom. That was a great question. Thanks.
Oh, thank you. At this point, we don't have any more questions.
Oh, I have a ton of questions, but I'm not going to ask them. I want to thank these brilliant young people, young scholars, for the work that they've done and for helping us to more deeply understand what's happening at East and what makes us excel and have made the improvements that we have made, but still need to work on other things. So I very much appreciate that. I think the biggest thing I took from all of this was that it's all about trust and relationships and building those relationships so that trust can continue to grow, and honesty, I think, and Sholanda's work on, recognizing the structural impediments, barriers to developing the trust needed for parents to engage. And all of you really have done a tremendous job. I'm so pleased, and thank you, Ms. Kelly, for I know that Ms. Kelly, you said at one time we were discussing, you said, so what's going to happen is are these just going to be in a on paper? I think that they've shown that, yeah, it will be on paper, but it will also be in their work, as Ms. Garfield has taken that, Dr. Garfield, excuse me, has taken that to her job as a principal, and Dr. Paco in the district, and Dr. Basile in her classroom, and soon to be Dr. next Monday, Durrett, to her work, her continuing work at East and at Warner. And, that it's so important that we feel a sense of belonging and that our identity and our humanity counts in schools. So I very much appreciate everything that you've all done. And I'm totally surprised we have 2 minutes, but I think we're good.
Let's make sure if there's nothing else out there that we missed. Oh, there's one more question. We got time for one more question. So this says, thank you so much for sharing your studies, increasing your incredible, interesting findings that have practical and transformative implications.
Yes, indeed.
Kudos, kudos, kudos.
All right. Thank you all.
Thank you for facilitating, Ms. Kelly,
Oh, it was
and
my
Joanne
pleasure.
as well.
It was my pleasure. And
Thank you
congratulations
for
to
having
all
us.
of you. Yeah, congratulations to all of you. I'm so impressed. Thank you.